I think most of you know me, but I always like to do this introduction since we've had a lot of new people join this forum, and some of them probably uh, don't know very much about who I am. But for those of you who don't know, I live here in Bozeman, Montana, uh, and we are on a 3/4 acre suburban lot. Sorry, this thing is moving. My dog was scratching underneath the table. Um, so we live on a 3/4 suburban lot, and a lot of you have seen these pictures before. We have a greenhouse. We have a pond as well that captures water off of the roof. And then we also have a food forest of fruit trees and berry bushes and some chickens, and then a large annual garden. And we managed to grow, a portion of our own food, not as much as I'd like yet, but we're certainly on the way to doing so. So I came to permaculture not through necessarily wanting to, not because I thought, fresh fruits and vegetables were amazing, which they are, but more from the perspective of how can I reduce my ecological footprint, how can I contribute in a positive way to a lot of the problems that I was seeing in the world, and also, how to better, create a meaningful life. So that is, the primary directive is as to why I got interested in permaculture. So let's get started in terms of a history of permaculture and some definitions. So I think I'm not sure how much background you have, and there's a lot of information out there. A lot of people come to permaculture through organic gardening, and I think the misunderstanding there is that that's all it is. But I hope during this introductory class you'll get a sense that it's way, way broader than just organic gardening. So permaculture was coined in the 1970s by two Australians, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, and it was in response to the growing use of industrial agriculture methods that they saw were leading to soil erosion, water pollution, all the ecological crises that we've seen times 10 or times 100 today. And they looked to traditional knowledge, scientific knowledge, and agroecology, ecological principles, indigenous wisdom, all of that stuff, and kind of put it into a framework and came out with the first book called Permaculture 1 in the late 1970s. And then Bill Mollison later refined the thinking, permaculture thinking, with his book I think he released it in 1988, and it's called Permaculture, a Designer's Manual. And in the permaculture field, this is really known as the Bible of permaculture, but to be honest, it's one of the most dense and unreadable textbooks out there with regards to permaculture. So oftentimes people who are new to this field, I don't actually recommend that they start with that designer's manual, even though it was one of the beginning texts, because it's way too dense and not that accessible to a lot of people. So there are other recommendations that I have, and if you have questions about that, please let me know. So it was started in the 1970s, and it was, like I said, in response to a lot of the ecological issues that they saw were leading to all of these problems. Basically, this idea that you can see in this quote, right? Civilized man has marched across the face of the earth and left a desert in his footprints. And one of the issues that they saw was that the problem was not so much a lack of intelligence. Obviously, we are able and have been able to get people to the moon. It wasn't a lack of technology. We have all that we need. It was a lack of design or dumb design. And so we see a lot of dumb design in our world today. And we are kind of experiencing the results of dumb design. So when you think about permaculture, it's not only about that garden in your backyard, it's about designing spaces and communities and neighborhoods in a super smart way. And as I go through these principles, I will be, in a way, referring back to what we're going through right now in terms of the pandemic, because there's so much that can be applied in terms of making us more resilient as a community if we apply a lot of permaculture principles. So maybe you want to not be thinking about the coronavirus right now, but it's actually very relevant to what we're going through. So, as probably a lot of you know, permaculture stands for permanent agriculture or permanent culture. And what I need to stress at people is it's not a technique. So people often say, oh, that's permaculture over there. Or, see this herb spiral, that's permaculture. It's not a specific technique, it's a design approach to your land and to your life. And another way to look at it is the conscious design and maintenance of agriculturally productive ecosystems, which have the diversity, stability, and resilience of natural ecosystems. And then a few other definitions here are consciously designed landscapes that mimic the patterns and relationships found in nature while yielding an abundance of food, fiber, and energy for the provision of local needs. So in other words, permaculture is not a really, there's not a really straightforward definition. It's really hard to describe in an elevator pitch, so to speak. They do say that for as many permaculture practitioners as there are that many definitions. People refer to it as a philosophy or a movement. But what I want you to get out of this class is that it is a design framework. And basically the prime directive is taking responsibility for our own existence and that of our children. That's kind of why we're doing the work that we're doing. I would say that a lot of people involved in the environmental movement or in permaculture, in growing, in gardening, that's what they are wanting to do. That we aren't the only, that we're looking a lot longer term. And this culture right now has been set up on a very short term approach to extract as many resources as we can and use them up and leave a desert in our footprints. So permaculture gives us a different way. And many of you might know that there are, this is a worldwide grassroots movement. So there's no hierarchy to it. At the beginning, Bill Mollison understood that the way to get the word out about permaculture and disseminate permaculture's information was through offering these 2-week-long permaculture design courses. And those have since been held in all sorts of places around the world. We had a live in-person one in Montana. I think it was 4 years ago now. It was great. Obviously now in our current context, doing more online permaculture design courses is what's happening, and there are definitely many, many resources out there in terms of permaculture design courses that you can take and you can get certified, and then you can start to practice on your own site. So essentially what permaculture means is building self-reliance, reducing our ecological footprint, increasing our resilience, and relocalizing our economies. And I think right now what this pandemic has showed us is that the current system that we have is super brittle. It's very fragile. And so permaculture thinking takes you more towards a resilient community, a resilient life, where there are closed loop systems, where you're not relying as much on some outside, out of scale economy in order to meet your needs. So another way that I like to look at permaculture is that it is a wardrobe or a toolbox. And what I mean by that is that the wardrobe is the framework, right? The permaculture framework. And depending on the climate that you're in, the culture that you're in, um, all of the different natural systems at play, the patterns on your landscape, you're going to use certain different things. You're going to put on certain different things to go out somewhere, right? So the same can be applied depending on the region that you're in. You're going to use certain things. Maybe in this context, you use gray water systems and you have a food forest and you use aquaculture, but maybe in this circumstance, those things don't make sense. So that's why you can't point to one thing and say, oh, that's permaculture. It's only permaculture if the whole design framework has been considered in order to put those elements on the site. So I want to make sure that if you are putting in a permaculture system, you have gone through the design process. You have considered what your goals are. You have considered the local culture. You have considered the landscape. You've taken time to do all of your research to implement what needs to happen on that site. So that's something really important to understand. So permaculture as a wardrobe or permaculture as a toolbox is a good way to look at it. You take out certain tools in certain contexts. In different contexts, you don't take out the same tools, but all of those tools are available to you. And your directive as a designer, as a permaculture designer, is to understand which tools are appropriate for which site. So, is this all making sense to people? Maybe give me a thumbs up or something. It's hard to do classes that aren't live. I'm used to having people taking these where I can see what's happening and if people are responding or not. So this is a new way of delivering classes. So another thing to realize is that permaculture is all about systems thinking. So we talk a lot about whole systems design. And right now, even before coronavirus, we had a crisis of systems, right? Ecological systems, social systems, political systems, moral systems. We have a real crisis. And the important thing to know is that there is no single blanket solution or new technology that is going to get us out of this. So one of the things that I hear a lot is, well, how can permaculture feed the world, or how are we going to feed 9 billion people? So there's not a silver bullet, right? The way that we're going to feed 9 billion people is by communities, local communities themselves figuring out how they're going to feed themselves. So systems thinking also involves looking at patterns and relationships and flows, and of course working with the natural systems that fit the local condition, terrain, and culture. Again, that tools in the toolbox, what's appropriate for what. And even on a small landscape level, right? You have that design thinking where if I go to a client site, I'm looking at the actual landscape, right? The slope, the soil, the terrain, but I'm also looking at how much time do they have to spend every day in their garden. That is very much the culture of that site, right? If you have a permaculture system or a permaculture design for a client that can spend 2 hours in her garden versus 10 hours in her garden, looks very different. So that's why you're designing to the site and to the culture. So, great, Lacey says, makes sense, good. So the current reality that we're dealing with, right, is kind of the opposite of systems thinking, right? We have linear systems, an extractive economy that demands unlimited growth. So right now, when people can't buy and consume, the economy is not working. That's why we need a stimulus package, right? People are freaking out because we can't continue to grow. Whereas again, the directive in permaculture is to observe natural systems. In a natural system, there's not unlimited growth. You reach a threshold, you reach a limit. Some of the values that we have right now are accumulation of wealth over all other values and a real extreme disconnection from natural systems, which is why we're where we're at. So what we need to do is have an ethic based on caring, sharing, mutual responsibility, and understanding that we're interdependent. And what has happened now with this current crisis is we understand how connected we are, right, for this virus to have moved throughout the world, um, and how dependent we are on community and connection. And so that's, one thing that'll come out of this, I would hope, is that there are other ways to design this world. There are better ways. Um, so now we're going to kind of get into the meat of permaculture. And again, for those of you just joining us, there is a handout that is available. You may have seen it on my little announcement in the forum that I was going live in 30 minutes, and the link to that handout is right below that. If you don't yet have the handout, you can go to also my website, brokengroundpermaculture.com, go to services, scroll down to workshops, and if you go to introduction to permaculture, that workshop, you'll see where to download those handouts. So this is when I'm getting into kind of the meat of really defining what permaculture is. So there are three ethics that underlie permaculture. So the first ethic is earth care, and an understanding that every living thing has an intrinsic worth. The forest, the streams, everything that we see in the living world has an intrinsic worth, and it's not just there for our taking. So that's the first ethic, earth care. The second ethic is people care, that we are doing this as well to take care of ourselves, that we want to be able to live as permanently as we can on this earth as a human species. And then the third ethic is fair share. And what that means is that's about limiting our consumption, and putting limits on our consumption, right? And that if there's a surplus in the system, we feed it back to the first two ethics. So what I mean by that is if there's, say, a surplus of manure in your system, you're feeding it back into the soil. If you have a surplus of vegetables, you're giving them to your neighbor. If you have a surplus of time, you are helping in the community garden. If you have a surplus of money, you are donating it to a good cause that helps make that community more resilient. So that's the whole ethic of fair share, that you're not just, it's kind of the opposite of that unlimited growth that we see in the current reality. You're understanding that in order for us all to survive on this earth, we can't just continue to take and take and take. So those are the three ethics, and I think a lot of people live by those ethics even if they don't know what permaculture is, right? It's like take care of the earth, take care of your friends and family, and share. But it's the permaculture principles that are kind of the fundamentals of understanding the design process and understanding how you want to set up a resilient system for your life and for your land. Oh, hello, Rachel. So let's move on to those principles. So that's where your handout comes in handy, where I do have this. This is from permacultureprinciples.com. The co-originator David Holmgren came up with these 12 principles. There are many, like any field, there are other people that have also come up with principles, but for me, these are the principles that I understand, that resonate with me the most. So on your handout, you have all these little icons with an explanation. You also have on that handout all of the different principles with a space in there for you to write any kind of notes if you want to as I go through these principles. So you got the ethics, and that's how people typically, live their lives, hopefully, if we're decent human beings. But these principles are really what make permaculture. So I'm going to go through these principles, and if you have any questions during this time, please feel free to put them in the comments. Um, so the first principle in permaculture is observe and interact. And if you saw my Designing Your Dream Homestead class that I gave the other day, you saw this principle in there as well. You know, the most important thing, the most important principle is observing and interacting with natural systems. That there are patterns on your site where you need to pay attention to them. So what are the water patterns on your site? Where's the slope? Where does the water collect? Where do the leaves collect? Where does the snow collect? Especially now in the early spring, this is a really good time to make those types of observations. Where does the snow melt more quickly? So on our site right now, you know, the front south-facing part of our property is almost devoid of all snow. But then there are areas, you know, very close to our back deck, because that's on the north side. There are areas close to where the hedges are, where there's still snow on the ground. So that's a really great and immediate place where you can understand some fairly clear microclimates of where's it warmer on your site. And that's really important when you come to considering a design. So you need to consider where are the prevailing winds, right? So there's a pattern that's happening on your site that you need to be aware of. You also need to be aware of the patterns that you have yourself. You know, where do you like to hang out during the day? Where do you never go on your property or in your place? What are the main roads of access that you have around your site, so that you can understand what patterns you have, because you want to design to those patterns as well. So that's a huge component to permaculture. And inherent in that is also just observing your site and not considering things necessarily as problems. Like being like, oh, that wet spot over there, I don't know what to do with it. That's a real problem. Bill Mollison liked to say, you know, it's not that there are too many slugs in your garden, it's that there aren't enough ducks. So inherent in the problem is the solution. I like to look at it as it's not that there are too many suburbs, lawns, you know, that there are too many lawns in the suburbs, it's that there aren't enough gardens, right? With all the development here that's happening in Bozeman, you know, on some of the best agricultural land, how can we turn that problem into a solution? If we can get more people growing in their backyards, that's ultimately what we want, right? We want people to be connected to their own food. And there are definitely, you know, studies that have been done that if you grow food yourself, right, you're more likely to buy it also from a local grower, because you then understand how much it takes to actually grow this food. So connecting to natural systems, having a backyard garden also connects you to this larger context of supporting the local economy. So definitely in our society, the way that it's been set up right now, with our agriculture being out of scale and our economy being out of scale, agriculture has become a problem. Our industrial agriculture model has become a problem in terms of fossil fuel use, in terms of tilling and soil loss, topsoil loss, in terms of chemicals and fertilizers that are used on the soil and are polluting our water and our air. So that has been a real problem. But agriculture is also the solution. That if you have people who do smaller scale agriculture, if you have local growers, if you have a smaller food system that's more localized, that is the solution to the problem, where we're not having to transport our food as far, and we're not having to use as many fossil fuels or chemicals because we're growing organically. So try to, as you look at your site, try to look at it in that way. You know, you're just observing and saying, oh, there's a wet spot there. Oh, that's where the leaves accumulate. And then from there, you can be like, oh, maybe that wet spot is where I put moisture-loving plants, or maybe that's where I put a pond. So always look at it in that way. So that's just the first principle. Second principle is catch and store energy. So you can see here in this photo, in this first photo on the left, all sorts of different ways that we're capturing and storing energy. And the idea here is that if you have a landscape, right, you have all of this free energy that's coming onto your site in the form of sun and wind and water, right? And you want to have that energy take the longest route possible through your site before exiting your site. So, because it's free and you want to capture it and store it as much as you can. So in this left-hand photo, I'm going to see if people are willing to participate. What are some of the ways that we're capturing and storing energy on this left-hand side? And this is actually David Holmgren's property near Melbourne, Victoria in Australia. If people are willing, tell me how we're capturing and storing energy on this site. So anyway, I'm going to give you a few minutes. And if nobody responds, I'll... Anyone? We've got, let's see. All right, well, if nobody wants to respond, so the ways that we're capturing and storing energy on this site are we have a greenhouse, right? Solar panels, great. Allison says solar panels, awesome. So there are solar panels here that are capturing the solar energy and using that as an off-grid thing. You're capturing and storing energy in terms of the actual greenhouse here on the site, right? Passive solar greenhouse, sun is going in, you're growing stuff in there. You are growing plants, which are offering shade, like Celine said. So you're growing all of these plants that are capturing and storing energy. So these are grapevines here. And then you have all this annual production in here that's capturing and storing the sun's energy. Then you also have all of this rock along here that's capturing and storing the sun's energy during the day and radiating that heat out at night and creating a microclimate. So multiple ways in which you're capturing and storing energy in this photo. And then of course, trees and planting trees is one of the best ways to store energy, capturing the sunlight, storing energy, and then of course giving out oxygen for us. So those are many different ways. So on your site, you're wanting to think about how I can capture and store that energy as well. Saving seeds is another way that you're capturing and storing energy, right? You're capturing that energy from that plant or from the sun. It's turned into that plant that's turned into that seed that you can then store to use next year. And then another way to capture is through rain barrels or rainwater and or these swales, right? Which for those of you who don't know, swales are very well known in the permaculture realm. In my opinion, they might be kind of overused in some contexts, but so what they're doing here in this picture is they have a slope, very gentle slope, and the water runs down this slope, right? And so they are wanting to sink and store that water rather than have that water run off and away from the property, right? So you want to, again, have that water take the longest route possible through your property, slow it, spread it, sink it into the soil, so that you can actually use it. And then what you do here in this context is you would grow, fruit trees and berry bushes along these berms, while capturing, being able to slow, spread, and sink that water into the ground. So capturing water is a big component of permaculture, and something that if in some of my longer courses, I talk more about it, and we spend a lot of time just on some of the techniques. So that's the second principle. The third principle is obtaining yield. So obviously we're doing all of this design work, we're trying to build these resilient local economies, and so we're not really thinking when we design a permaculture site, it's not really about ornamentals, right? It's not, the prime directive is certainly not aesthetic, although of course permaculture places are become very beautiful, just because they're not, they're mimicking natural systems, but you're not putting in a lot of ornamental plants. So that's where there's, a difference between that and, say, a landscape designer, a conventional landscape designer. You're trying to obtain some sort of yield. So whether that's food or whether that's medicine, whether that's forage, whatever that might be. And then, especially in a cold climate, you're trying to extend that yield in time. Because we have such a short growing season here in Montana, we really have to figure out a way. And if our directive is, okay, we want as much self-reliance and want to grow as much food for ourselves as possible, we need to figure out ways in which to preserve that food and to extend that yield for as long as possible. So that's when we ferment, we dehydrate, we freeze, we do all of those things so that we can continue to eat from our garden well into the winter. So I still have, for example, a lot of dehydrated pears and apples, right? Or we have grape juice still, we have apple cider still, we have frozen gooseberries and raspberries and strawberries. We're still eating from our garden, even though not much is growing outside, right? So we have to set up those systems, and then that's where, in a cold climate especially, we're also looking at season extension, right? Understanding that we have a short growing season, so how can we extend that yield for longer in a cold climate? And that's when we're talking about greenhouses or hoop houses or frost cloth, really figuring out a way to eke out at least maybe a couple more weeks or a couple more months. So with our small greenhouse, we can extend the season on both ends, maybe by a month on each end. And so in this type of climate, that makes a huge difference. So I'm eating early season greens a lot earlier. I'm starting to eat them while outside, I'm only starting to plant them. So we want to look at, that's when you take the tools in your toolbox, those season extension techniques and those strategies that you can then use and apply on your site. So fourth principle, I think, is what we're at, is self-regulate and accept feedback. So the idea here is that these are dynamic systems. So that's another difference between putting in an ornamental landscape versus a permaculture landscape, right? An ornamental one is like, you put it in, you put weed mat down, you put some mulch on top, and then it's kind of set it and forget it, right? With a permaculture system, there's always this interplay of putting stuff in, trying stuff out, and then accepting the feedback. Did that work? Did that not? Was that a good idea? I don't know, right? So when you come up with a master plan, say for your property, it's not static. It's a good plan to get you pointed in the right direction, but it is going to change over time because the longer you spend on a site, the more you observe. And some of that observation can only come from when you actually implement. We can do a lot of background observation of the site and collect as much information as possible, but then there is a certain amount of, let's try this out, see if this works, and if it doesn't, then we accept the feedback and we do something else and we pivot. And this principle is especially relevant today, right? On a global level, we are not self-regulating and we are not accepting the feedback. Before this whole crazy pandemic, right, we are and have been for quite some time in a climate crisis, right? The earth has been telling us, hey, by the way, things aren't going so awesome, right? This is what's happening. The climate is changing. Can you accept the feedback and self-regulate and do something different? And because our system isn't set up that way, we're in the place that we're in right now. And of course, there's been a lot of stuff out there around, this pandemic is the earth telling us, oh, hey, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it for you. So, so really, right now, as a society, there's a great opportunity here to accept the feedback that we've received and change things accordingly. How can we change our economies? How can we change our agriculture? How can we reconnect as local communities? Whether we'll do it, I don't know, but at least we have these tools. And so that's just something to keep in mind, self-regulate and accept feedback. And, on the micro scale of your site, oh, I put my tomatoes there and they didn't do so awesome. Accepting that feedback and being like, oh, is that because my soil isn't great? Is that because I didn't have enough sun? Is that because I didn't take care of them or water them correctly? And then being like, okay, maybe it's one of those things, maybe I'll do that differently, or maybe I need to move them to a totally different site, right? So as much of that as that we can do, and that these are living, changing, dynamic systems, that will help you as you implement any kind of permaculture design. So next principle is use and value renewable resources. And obviously, we are putting in these systems so that we can be less dependent on the fossil fuel industry. And so we want to take advantage of wind energy. We want to take advantage of solar energy. And we also want to potentially, if you have the space, you want to take advantage of and use animals. Animals are renewable resources. You give them a home, they do some work for you. Just like, for example, these goats, right? This is what's called a goat tractor. This is a place that I worked at in Australia where these goats are tethered to this tractor and the owner would move them to areas where they could forage and keep down certain plants, right? While at the same time they're pooping in that area at the same time. So again, that's good design, right? You're designing where you're using the animals in places where they can do the work for you. Same with a chicken tractor, right? Where you can, a mobile chicken coop, where this is our little chicken tractor on our site. There's my dog. So we can move this tractor around where we can put 2 to 3 chickens in this little tractor. There's a nesting box in the back here, and they can move around the site to where we want them to go. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll attach a mesh fence. We'll open up this little thing here and we'll attach a mesh fence to this and surround a whole other area, say in the early spring or the late fall, like a garden area where I want them to fertilize or I want them to scratch up. So we can use and value them in a permaculture system. So the next principle is produce no waste. So we want to create on our property and in a community, right? We want to produce as little waste as possible. We want to create what are called closed loop systems. So that obviously means here, this is a workshop I did a few years ago where we're building a compost pile. So composting is, one of the easiest ways to produce no waste, right? Your kitchen scraps that come, that come from the vegetables that you've planted in your garden, they go then back into the compost and create this closed loop system. Then you're also thinking on your property of, or in your home, right? How can you use less energy? Dry clothes instead of using a dryer, right? How can you can insulate your house more so you're using less energy? And then, talking about how to use less plastic and bring less into your life. So kind of looking at your consumption patterns. And some of you may have seen that I did a whole video with Julie Fathy, a woman here in town, about zero waste and how she goes about creating a zero waste lifestyle and cutting down, buying in bulk so you're not using plastic bags, really being intentional about not producing waste on your site, whether it's in your garden area or whether it's kind of in your home, but always having that directive. The other thing to keep in mind is, of course, all of these principles can be applied both on a landscape level, they can be applied at a lifestyle design level, but they can be applied at a community-wide level. So right now in Bozeman, we have two great companies, Yes Compost and Happy Trash Can, that are doing residential pickup of compost, right? So they're trying to close a loop with it on a community-wide level for the waste that's produced in our community. And then they are producing all of this great compost, and then community members like myself, gardeners and others in the area, farmers, can then pick up that compost and put it back into their systems. So that's a really, it's applying on a micro scale and a macro scale in terms of how we can do this. And of course, some businesses, some more ethically minded businesses are looking at this as well. How can they as a business produce less waste and have sustainability practices? So again, you can see how all these principles can be applied at several different scales. All right, how's everybody doing? Is this making sense? And I see that a few more people have joined us. So if you don't have the handouts, remember to go to my website, brokengroundpermaculture.com, go to services, go to workshops, and then go to Introduction to Permaculture, and you'll find it. I also included it in one of the posts below in this forum. So if you need to get that, definitely do. So next principle. Oh, and then there's this idea, of course, that when the needs of a system aren't met within, we pay the price in energy and pollution. So if you produce a resource, right, like manure in a system, and you can't feed it, if you can't find a place to input it back into the system, it becomes pollution, right? It becomes a liability. So that's why a factory farm is a super dumb design, right? Not only is it out of scale, but they create an incredible amount of manure, which is a huge liability because they haven't designed a system where you would feed that manure back into the system. So it's a really dumb design. Same with, again, these are extractive economies where you haven't figured out where the outputs of one system become the inputs of another system. And whether that's on your property or at a community-wide level, you want to think about those circular economies, that circular type of design. So here you got the industrial ag farm, factory farm, right? Where in this situation, manure is a liability and it's a real problem. Whereas in a permaculture farm, right, that's smaller scale, you have the animals being, rotating through certain pastures, pooping in those pastures that feed that soil, that grow the pasture for the animals, right? Good design, bad design. And so thinking through, for you, depending on what your site has and what elements of your site you have, what are wastes that you're producing that you need to feed back into your system in some other way. So next principle is design from patterns to details. And so what I mean by that is you are first looking at the big picture, and this is what I talked about in my Designing Your Dream Homestead online class, right? Where I first want to know what your goals are for your property before I tell you where you're going to put your greenhouse. So same thing here, right? Where you first have to understand the patterns of a site. Where's the sun? Where's the shade? Where's the wind? All of those different things. You have to understand the patterns and the culture of your site before you get down to where exactly you're going to put what. And so that's really important. Otherwise, you're piecemealing a site. And that's why having a map is so important as well, right? You can design on the ground, but having a big picture vision and view of your place is really useful and helps you design a better, it helps you come up with a better design, ultimately. Another principle is integrate, don't segregate. And so what I mean by this is that, you know, there is a tendency, or there has been, right, in conventional landscape design of like, here's your grass, here's your flower garden, here's where the kids hang out, here's maybe your vegetable garden. Everything is segregated. And in a permaculture system, you want to consider your yard as an entire ecosystem and figure out ways where you can integrate things as much as possible. So why aren't the flowers why can't the flowers be integrated into the garden, right? They'll help attract beneficial insects, they'll cut down on pests. Why can't the place where kids play and hang out also be the garden, right? Why can't there be a place that's maybe a kid's garden or a cool little sunflower area for them to play in that also supports the garden but also supports the kids? So this whole idea of integrating and not segregating is really important. And inherent in that is this idea that each element performs multiple functions. And what I mean by an element is, an element in your system is like chickens, or a pond, or a greenhouse, or the annual garden, or the food forest, right? You want to have those things in your system perform multiple functions. You don't want to just have them for one function alone, because again, we're trying to create resilient systems. So, for example, with chickens, you want the chickens for their eggs. You know, you may have them for eggs, but you also want them for their manure, which is great in terms of fertility for your garden. Their feathers can contribute to the compost and again provide fertility. They're gonna have eggs. They're also gonna let off heat, right? And some people might have them for meat as well, right? So you have these chickens for multiple purposes and not just one alone. Same idea. Here's a picture of our pond. We have this pond for multiple reasons. We have it because it helps capture water off of our roof, and store that water on our site. It creates a microclimate. It attracts beneficial insects into the garden, right? So it supports this garden right here. It grows aquatic plants, some of which can be edible if we want, but we don't eat the plants from the pond. But what we do is any overgrowth of plants from the pond, all of this goes back into the garden. So if there's an overgrowth of lily pads, for example, that will go into our compost, right? Or of algae. Sometimes I just kind of skim that off and put it directly on the garden beds, right? So we have this pond, and of course it attracts so many birds onto our site. So that brings us joy to watch the birds, and of course it gives them more habitat. So you have this pond for how many reasons was that? Maybe 5 or 6 reasons that I just listed. And it's not just for one reason. So think of your sites that way. You know, how many functions can they serve, right? Our greenhouse is, yes, obviously a place for early season greens, late fall greens, hot crops, but it's also a place where I store my tools, right? It's also a place where I store my pots, where I start my seedlings. I'm thinking of experimenting with it, although I haven't yet, in the midsummer as a place where you could dehydrate fruit, right, on the very top where it gets super hot, right? So you just don't have an element for one particular function. And then you also want to consider that each function that you want to have on your property, right, that is supported by multiple elements. So if you want to collect water, if capturing water is one of the functions that you want to have, which is recommended, especially in our climate, right, where we have limited water in July, say, and again, we're trying to design resilient systems. So if your function is to capture water, right, you can do that by having a water tank, by having a rain barrel. You can also do that by having mulching, say, things in your food forest really well, right, so that they conserve that water moisture. So when it does rain, that water moisture stays in the ground for longer. You can also harvest it by planting a living ground cover in your food forest again, where bare soil, water runs off of bare soil. But if you plant a living ground cover, of course, you're going to absorb that water onto the site. You can harvest it by having a pond, and then you can harvest it by having swales on contour, again, which are these ditches on contour that you saw earlier in the presentation. So again, you have 5 different ways that you're harvesting water. So if one of these fails, if you suddenly your water tank breaks or something like that, you still have other ways where you're conserving water on the property. So that's where you can see this being a resilient system, right? So that in adverse conditions, if you lose some of this, you still have backup. And this is, again, when you're in an emergency situation, if you don't have backups, that's not a very resilient system. That's very brittle. Next principle is choose small and slow solutions. So obviously, we don't want to do kind of large-scale agriculture. One of the reasons that we are in the crisis that we're in right now, the ecological crises that we are seeing, is that our agriculture is out of scale, our economy is out of scale. We've created these global systems that don't really lend themselves to resilience, and we are seeing that very clearly right now, right? So at the micro scale of your site, right, you obviously want, smaller scale gardens. And when you start implementing a permaculture design, I would highly recommend that you don't do it all at once, right? So what I've seen fail with a lot of permaculture sites is that oftentimes people start with a very large site and they have a lot amount of capital behind them, and they will often fail because they put in everything at once, and then they're like, oh, okay, now I have to maintain all of this. How am I supposed to do this? Oh, that means that I have to hire somebody in perpetuity at 20 hours a week because I put in a system that's way out of scale for what I can maintain or what I understand I can actually do in the amount of time that I have. So definitely starting with small and slow solutions and choosing small and slow solutions first is definitely important. And then obviously permaculture principle, I don't know where we're at, what principle we're at, but I think it's 11 or 10, use and value diversity. So only 20 plant species make up 90% of the human diet. That's a little scary. That's not very resilient. What happens if we lose 5 of those plant species, right? So when I'm on even, you want to think about diversity in terms of growing a variety of different food on your site, right? So if your function is, I want to produce as much food as possible for myself and my family, right? That's your function. Support that by multiple elements. I'm going to have an annual garden. I'm going to have a food forest of fruit trees. I'm going to have chickens. I'm going to have ducks. I might have goats. You may not have all of those things, right? But that's an example. You're going to do it in various different ways. My husband hunts, right? So we have a way to get meat as well. So multiple different ways that we're trying to provide food for our family or for designing for food. And if you can't meet those all on your site, right, that's also not the point, right? We are looking for self-reliance, not self-sufficiency. We also want to rely on our community. We don't necessarily want to do this all alone, because what we've discovered in having to be a part like this is that we're inherently communal beings, right? We like being with people and we like interacting with people. So you may not produce all of that on your site, right? But you have local farmers where you can get eggs, or you have other local dairies where you can get cheese if you want that, or meat. And so building and designing a life for yourself that's resilient, that's locally based, is the directive. And even for me, diversity, so you have all these different things that you're growing, but then even within the things that you're growing, like the tomatoes, I'll grow 5 or 7 different varieties of tomatoes, or 2 different varieties of broccoli or 3 different types of peppers. So if one of those fails, right, doesn't thrive, is not good for this climate, right, I haven't lost my entire tomato crop, or I haven't lost my entire pepper crop. So that's another way that you want to think about it, you know, diversity between species and within. And that's also where you're talking about polyculture beds and plant communities, right? So you're not doing monocultures of crops. We know that those are not good, right? That they're disadvantageous. You're thinking about polyculture. So in here, this is what's called a brassica circle. This was prepped beforehand with this little chicken coop area. So the chickens were prepping the bed and then they moved the coop. So the chickens were prepping the bed here and then they moved it over here. So this is a brassica circle, right, where they're growing. The primary yield from here is broccoli and cabbage, right? But they have all sorts of supportive species like dill and beets and garlic and all sorts of supportive species that are helping to repel pests, attract beneficial insects, and you're also getting a yield from those support species as well. So you're doing that, and then, you know, this is us growing a food forest, right? A diverse, well, this is not us growing a food forest here. This is our site in 2012 when we first acquired our place, right? Just all grass in the back. And then we planted a food forest. So by 2016, this is what it looked like. So you can see the small fruit trees here. That's the plum. There's a cherry in the back there, a pear over here, an apple here. A ground cover, there's clover, there's mint, there's these are Champlain roses, these are chives, these are currants, red and black currants. These are all, you know, iris, obviously, over here. So thinking from a perspective of, one, the diversity in this particular area is substantial, right? Two, we've captured and stored a lot of energy, as opposed to that, right? Grass, where you just have to water it and mow it and water it and mow it. This situation, right? We've put in a lot of mulch down. We're growing a living ground cover that helps build the soil, right? So we're absorbing and capturing that water. We're absorbing and capturing that sunlight, and that's contributing. And so that's a way more resilient system, right? And this is just a view of it. Some of you may have seen this. I did a tour of a video of the tour of a food forest area. And you can see here, so we don't own between this fence line and this sidewalk. So that's all, you know, your conventional approach, right? Lawn, where you're not producing anything except work for yourself, where you have to mow it, where they fertilize it, where they water it every single day, which really makes me very angry, but you don't get any kind of yield out of it, right? Whereas this whole system where you're not mowing anything, I water in here from about the beginning of July to mid-August, once a week typically. So once a week I'm watering in here, but in the meantime all this mulch is helping absorb stuff. All of these plants are helping to support this little mini ecosystem. The reason this looks a lot different now, this is in 2016, this whole area now has an understory of herbaceous stuff in it. So again, this is a way more resilient system and gives you an incredible amount of food, right? And this is less than 1/4 of an acre. It's kind of, it's almost like 1/8 of an acre or something like that. So in a fairly small space, you can produce an incredible amount of food. And these are some of the things that we got out of it last year, right? So pears and plums and grapes and some medicinal plants and apples, raspberries, chokeberries, cherries, and alpine strawberries. So all of these possibilities in a fairly, relatively speaking, small space, right? You think about those giant acres and acres, right, of agricultural land that we have out there. You know, you think about what could be possible if you grew intensively in your kind of the backyard suburban, garden area. So next principle is optimize edge. And the idea here is that the edge is where the action is. So if you are the understanding here is if you have, say, a grassland area and a forest area, right? There are 5 species in the forest area, there are 5 in the grassland area, and there are 5 along the edge, but also the species from the grassland and the forest also are along that edge. So you think about if you go fishing, right? The place where you catch the fish is along the edges and the shorelines and the reefs, right? Not right in the middle of the ocean or in the middle of the lake. So really optimizing edge. So one example that I like to give is, this is the Mississippi. What if the Mississippi was just straight, right? We would have lost all these different opportunities for productivity along the edge, because this is a different microclimate than this area, right? So just really considering and optimizing edge. So for example, in a pond, yeah, you could make a circle, but why not, crenellate the edge so that you create different little environments in here for habitat for different things. So same area, but you've created an edge. Again, there are no straight lines in nature. So we are very linear thinkers, and there's nothing wrong necessarily with, 3 or 4 raised beds that are kind of linear. You have to design to your lifestyle and what makes most sense. But the opportunity to have a curved path creates more edge, or a keyhole path where you go down this path and this is pathway in here, but you plant all in this area. These designs and these patterns resonate with us more as well, right? Because we're used to looking at these patterns in natural systems. And so this is an example of like a little permaculture garden where, you have these keyhole beds and you're moving through these pathways. And that's, probably for some more aesthetically pleasing than maybe the linear raised beds. And again, this is our herb spiral, where again, you're mimicking the spiral pattern in nature that you see really, really often. So this is illustrative of various different things, right? You're creating a microclimate, so you're mimicking the pattern of the spiral. You're also creating a different microclimates, right? The top here is much hotter and drier than the bottom here, right? Then you're also using the rock to capture and store energy and radiate it out at night. So what I ended up doing here a lot in my herb spiral is planting a lot of basil, right? You can see there's rosemary and sage here. Planting a lot of basil, also putting my peppers here because it's more of a warm environment for them, and they do really well. So again, looking at patterns, optimizing edges. All right, we're wrapping up here too. Last principle is creatively use and respond to change. So what you want to do is if you kind of look at and set up your property using all of these principles, right? What it allows you to do is to respond to change, right? And respond to adverse conditions. If you've set up a thing where each element performs multiple functions, each function is supported by multiple elements, you've set up closed loop systems, you've set up more of a self-reliant homestead because you have a diversity of things that you're growing in that environment, right? Then you're able to respond to change more effectively. And that's ultimately kind of our goal in permaculture, right? How do we set up the most resilient system possible? So for example, in a year where we got a really hard frost, June 11th, right? My cherries were coming along, they were looking beautiful, got a hard frost, lost all the cherries, right? But still had currants, still had gooseberries, right? So you've set up your system where there's still food coming out of your property, despite the fact that things are going to happen. There are going to be years, and especially now where we can't, the weather is becoming more unpredictable. We can't predict hailstorms necessarily. We don't know what kind of growing season we're going to have. So what are ways in which you can set it up to be the most resilient possible, you know. So that's when having a greenhouse or having a season extension is really helpful. Again, I have failures in on my property all the time, every year, right? But there's always food somewhere coming out of the property so that if something doesn't yield one year, you have something else to rely on. And this is, you know, our ideal utopic environment, right? Where we're capturing sun and wind, and we have solar panels, and we have greenhouses, and we're having chickens, and we're growing a lot of our own food, and we're living as a community in this space. This is what, you know, there's been an incredible increase in interest in permaculture and growing our own food since this whole pandemic thing happened. And one of the hopes, right, the problem is the solution here, right, where one of my hopes is that this pushes people to become more self-reliant. Hopefully, we don't come to it from a place of fear, but one of abundance and one of community building. That there's a real opportunity here to get more and more people growing their own food. And maybe also recognizing that they can do more of their work from home, right? That they don't have to get in a car and commute. That the ideal environment is for us to create agrihoods, right? Suburbs where people are producing a lot of their own food or they collectively have a little farm so that they don't have to get in their car to drive everywhere to meet all of their basic needs, right? So there are real opportunities here of how we can design a better life for ourselves and a better community. So, kind of in conclusion, what I want you to get out of this is that permaculture means working with rather than against natural systems, right? A lot of what we've done in the past is, oh, that's a problem. That wet spot is a problem. We're going to pump water out of that area so that we can put what we want there, rather than harmonizing with those natural patterns and saying, okay, that is a wet place on our property. We're going to understand that that's what the pattern is on the site. What are we going to do accordingly? It's applying the principles of natural systems, protracted and thoughtful observation rather than protracted and thoughtless labor. I've definitely done that before. And looking at systems and people and all of their functions, right? And then the permaculture design aims for a site itself, right, is a closed system that meets its own needs. High yields, low maintenance, that's a harder one. Non-polluting a lifestyle, harmonizing with natural patterns, and ultimately, right, a diverse and resilient system that can endure adverse conditions, right? So you think about if you had in this type of situation, you know, people are panicking and they're getting, you know, food and they're stocking up, and you know, what if you had set up a system, and many of you, I think, in this group already have, right, where you've preserved and canned a lot of your stuff, or you have dehydrated stuff, or you have meat in the freezer, or you have eggs and chickens already on your site, right? You feel a lot more secure rather than relying again on the kind of fossil fuel industrial ag system to support you. And, you know, they say that we have, you know, on average 3 days, right? If transportation stopped, we have on average 3 days of food in a community. Whereas I think what we want to set up on our sites, right, is the ability to have, you know, months of food in our community if possible. So those are some of the design aims. And then I like to use this idea that we're really trying to, on our properties and in our communities, shift from fire to flow. So shifting from the burning of oil, gas, and coal to understanding flows of energy, you know, and capturing those flows from the sun, the wind, the water in renewable ways. We're looking at flows, creating passive solar homes, greenhouses, solar panels, solar hot water, building rainwater capture devices, right? Capturing the flows of water, rain gardens, swales, wind turbines, geothermal heat, right? So I think this is a real opportunity now to look at how we can shift on a bigger scale, but locally, and in our homes, how can we shift that from that fire to flow? And I think this is a quote from Rosemary Morrow. I learned from her. I did a permaculture teacher training with her. She wrote the book Earth User's Guide to Permaculture, which actually is one of the more this would be one of my recommendations in terms of a good starter book for permaculture. If I were to choose one, it would be this one or Gaia's Garden by Toby Hemingway. So both of those books are really great introductions to permaculture. And this is kind of what we're going for as a culture, right? Is this idea that when I think about the food I need for the day, my mind goes to what's growing in the garden, not what's stashed in the refrigerator. That we're designing lives that are deeply connected to natural systems, deeply connected to growing our own food. And we're not too far from this, right? As I described in my other class, my grandmother was a homesteader, right? She did all of these things. She grew food, she preserved food, she canned, and they ate a good portion of their food from my grandmother's efforts. We just skipped a generation or two, so it's not that hard to go back to this. So are there any, I wanted to tell you a little bit about what's next before we go into questions. Think about if you have any questions, and please post them in the comments if you do have any follow-up questions. Again, if you haven't watched my Designing Your Dream Homestead class that I gave the other day, it's again in this forum. So what's great about knowing about permaculture principles and then doing that class is that you can then take those principles and consider your property through that lens, right? You're going over your goals, you're understanding your site, you're understanding the sector and zone analysis that we did in that class, but then you're also considering you have those permaculture principles in the back of your head in terms of the elements that you want on your property and the functions that you want them to serve, and then thinking about closed loop systems, thinking about diversity in your system, thinking about how to integrate your system. So that's why it's really great to understand these permaculture principles as you go about designing your site. For those who have smaller spaces, I am doing a class on small space gardening next Thursday, again in this forum. Signing up for my newsletter. I do produce other videos that I send out and let my newsletter know. And then of course there's a lot of information on my blog of existing videos and information. And you can follow me on Instagram at Broken Ground Montana. For those of you who don't know. Then I also want to let you know about a few other things. I do have an online Edible Backyard series, which is a very comprehensive class. So if you want to dive deeper into any of these topics around planning and designing your backyard, composting and soil building, and gardening strategies and techniques, I do have a spring discount on that. So that is where I have a bunch of worksheets for you to go through as you're planning and designing. I go more into detail around composting and vermicomposting and what you can do, what strategies you can take to build your soil, and then more gardening strategies and techniques where we go through kind of season extension and vegetable growing, etc. So if you want something and you have lifetime access to it, so it's way more involved and a deeper dive into some of what I have covered. And then I do have, as many of you know, I do one-on-one garden consultations and do designs for clients if that's of interest. I work with a lot of clients remotely, so if we have to do this online with you giving me information about your site, I'm certainly happy to do that. And or we can set up a time so that when we're no longer, hopefully, sheltering in place, I can come out to your site and we can stand at least 6 feet from one another and I can give you some advice. And then lastly, I wanted to check whether people would be interested in some kind of permaculture design series masterclass that would be online. So I'm going to send this out to the whole forum, where I would do live Zoom call classes on these topics, so go way more into detail about the starting soil building, creating a food forest, capturing water, and then there'd be some Q&A sessions to get your specific answers, questions answered with regards to your specific property. So this would be some kind of sliding scale paid class that I would do on Zoom, but there'd be way more interaction, where if people, I'm sure, have used the Zoom platform now, where you can get on and ask specific questions to me, and it's more dynamic. So let me know, and if you want to let me know right now here about this, that would be great. Wow, now I'm noticing all of these comments that I didn't notice before. So thank you. Let me answer. Okay, so Nevada says, yes, I'd be interested in a master class. Okay, great. So let me know if anybody else would be interested in a master class, and then also if you have any other questions. And now I'm going to look a little bit at, oh great, Stephanie says, I'm brand new to the permaculture concept. This is great information. Great. Yes, absolutely. This is from a global level to permaculture concepts can be applied. One other thing to look at is they can be applied on a social level too, and that's something that we'll get into if we do this masterclass. Is you're applying these fundamentals at a landscape level, but at a social level in terms of your life design. So what we're talking about always is creating resilience, both inner resilience in terms of our inner landscape. How do we weather these types of crazy events, right? What do we do? What kind of daily practices do we have that get us through this? And how do we create resilience on our land? So we'll get more into that in the masterclass. If people are interested, I may bring on some guest speakers as well. So I'm just starting to think about this in terms of a way to provide more content to people, obviously in an online way, but where you can get more like customized support from me as to your actual property design. So if you are interested, definitely let me know. Yeah, so D, you said you're not sure if you need the master class or the edible landscapes class since you live in town. I would probably, well, it depends on how much interaction you want. If you do the online edible backyard series, you can then just ask questions of me in this forum. And if you want to set up after that an online consultation, you know, a one-on-one online consultation, that might be the way to go. If you, let's talk. So why don't you email me and we can just set up a time to chat on the phone, and I can direct you in terms of what would work best for your site. But let me know if people have an interest in this, and I'll also post this on the forum. So do we have any questions? Oh, Lacey, you said masterclass. Great. Awesome. Any other questions before I leave you all? I realize I went over time. This is kind of par for the course. I can talk about this stuff forever. And sorry, let's see. Okay, I think there are any other questions, although feel free if you do have any, and for those of you who are watching this after afterwards, just post them in the forum. Feel free to post, you know, just as a separate post, what kind of questions you have. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I think most of you are in Montana, so well, here in Gallatin County, or no, everywhere in Montana, right? We have a shelter in place, so be good, stay safe. If you have started seeds, tend to your seedlings. If you have a greenhouse, go water in the greenhouse. And I look forward to connecting with you in the forum. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye. Have a good day.